I spent 11 years doing environmental site assessments before the Utah contract came through. Most of that work was unremarkable. Phase 1 reports for commercial property transfers, soil sampling around decommissioned gas stations, the occasional brownfield redevelopment where someone needed a geologist to confirm what everyone already suspected about the groundwater. Bread and butter consulting. The kind of work where the worst thing you encounter is a dry well log that doesn't match the county record. The uranium mine survey was different from the beginning, and not in the way I expected. My firm, Bridger Environmental, out of Boise, picked up the contract through the Bureau of Land Management's Legacy Mine Inventory Program. The federal government maintains a database of abandoned hard rock mines across the western states, and thousands of them. Most were punched into the earth during the Cold War uranium boom of the 1950s, when the Atomic Energy Commission was buying every pound of yellowcake the Colorado Plateau could produce. When the price collapsed, the miners walked away. They left open adits, waste rock piles, contaminated tailings, and 60 years of quiet radioactive decay sitting in the desert sun. Our scope was straightforward. BLM had identified a cluster of 11 mine sites in San Juan County, southeastern Utah, that had never received a formal hazard assessment. We were to visit each site, document physical hazards, open shafts, unstable portals, collapsed stopes, measure ambient radiation, collect soil and water samples where applicable, and produce a report recommending prioritized remediation. The contract specified a 2-week field rotation for 2 assessors, with a BLM liaison available by radio. Standard work. The kind of thing Bridger had done a dozen times in Nevada and Montana. I drove down with my partner Darren on the second Monday of October. Darren was 5 years younger than me, a geochemist by training who'd shifted into environmental work after his postdoc funding dried up. He was quiet, precise, and better with instruments than anyone else at the firm. We'd worked together on 3 previous mine surveys, without any friction, which in this business counts for a lot. 2 weeks in a rental truck with someone you can't stand will ruin a project faster than bad weather. We staged out of Blanding, a small town on the northern edge of the Navajo Nation. The motel was a single-story concrete block building on the main highway, the kind of place where the bedspread pattern hasn't changed since 1988, and the Wi-Fi password is taped to the nightstand with surgical tape. Blanding exists because of uranium. The White Mesa Mill, 6 miles south of town, is one of the last conventional uranium processing facilities still operating in the United States. The whole region carries that history in its geology and its economy and its health statistics. You see it in the landscape, roads that lead to nothing, concrete pads where headframes used to stand, tailings, ponds fenced off with chain link and radiation placards fading in the sun. Our BLM contact was a woman named Priya, a natural resources specialist based in the Monticello field office. She met us at the motel the evening we arrived. We spread a set of USGS topographic quads across the hood of her truck and walked us through the 11 sites. Most were small prospect workings. Single adits driven a few dozen meters into Chinle Formation sandstone, chasing carnotite veins that had played out quickly. 3 were more substantial operations with multiple levels and documented production records. 2 of those had been partially sealed by the state in the 1990s, concrete plugs poured across the portals. But Priya told us the seals had cracked or been vandalized on at least 1. She flagged 1 site in particular. It appeared on the quad as Mine Number 7, though the BLM database listed it under a different claim name that I'll call the Roth Lease, after the family that had filed the original patent, and it was the most remote of the 11. 14 miles down an unpaved road that branched off State Route 95. Then another 3 miles on a track that Priya described as optimistic, even by San Juan County standards. The Roth is the one I'd prioritize, she said. We've had 2 reports from recreational hikers in the last 18 months. Both said the portal was open and accessible. One of them went in far enough to see a second level. That shouldn't exist based on the production records we have. Darren asked what she meant. The Roth is documented as a single-level adit mine, one horizontal tunnel following a mineralized bed in the moss-back member. Roughly 40 meters of development before the ore pinched out, and the original operator reported minimal production. Less than 2 tons of ore shipped to the buying station in Monticello. But this hiker described a vertical shaft inside the adit, going down, and a draft coming up from it. Could be a natural feature, I said. Solution cavities in the Chinle aren't unusual. Could be, Priya agreed. That's why you're here. We started with the easier sites. The first 4 days were routine, documenting open portals, measuring gamma radiation with a Ludlam 19 survey meter, taking soil samples from waste rock piles. The readings were elevated, but unsurprising. Carnotite ore fluoresces under UV light and shows canary yellow staining on sandstone surfaces, and we found plenty of both. The most significant hazard at most sites was physical. Rotten timber, loose rock, and the possibility of a floor collapse into an unseen void below. Standard abandoned mine dangers. We flagged them, photographed them, logged GPS coordinates, and moved on. Darren was meticulous about his field notes. He used a hardbound write in the rain notebook, numbered every entry, cross-referenced each measurement to the instrument serial number and calibration date. I mention this because what happened later would have been easy to dismiss as sloppy documentation. And I want to be clear that Darren was not sloppy. His records from those first 4 days are still in the project file, and they're immaculate. We reached the Roth lease on Friday of the first week. The drive was as bad as Priya had warned. The last 3 miles crossed exposed slick rock and loose sand that had the truck fishtailing even in 4-wheel drive, where the landscape out there is austere in a way that photographs don't capture. Red Wingate sandstone cliffs rising from pale desert floor, juniper and pinon pine clinging to the talus slopes, and a silence so complete you can hear your own pulse when the engine cuts off. There's no cell service, no line of sight to any structure or road. The GPS showed our position as a blue dot floating in an empty beige field. The mine portal was cut into the base of a low sandstone cliff, facing roughly northeast. It was exactly as Priya described. Open, unbarricaded, about 2 meters wide and 1.5 meters tall. Classic Cold War prospect adit. The waste rock pile fanned out from the entrance in a low apron, colonized by cryptobiotic soil crust that suggested decades without disturbance. Someone had spray-painted a radiation trefoil on the cliff face beside the portal at some point, but it had faded to a faint pink ghost. We followed protocol, set up the base station 50 meters from the portal, unpacked the instruments, ran background readings. Ambient gamma was slightly elevated, around 35 micro-row engines per hour, compared to a regional background of maybe 12 to 15. Consistent with a small uranium working, nothing alarming. Darren pulled on his half-face respirator and clipped the personal dosimeter to his collar. I did the same. We'd brought a multi-gas detector, an industrial scientific Ventus MX4, to monitor oxygen levels, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and combustible gases inside the mine. Radon was the real concern at a uranium site. But radon monitoring requires either a continuous monitor or the alpha track detectors deployed over time. We had both, but the continuous monitor was reserved for sites where we'd be spending more than an hour underground. For the initial walkthrough, The MX4 and dosimeters were standard. The adit was dry. That was the first thing I noticed. Most of these old workings accumulate seepage. Water percolating through sandstone finds every crack and follows it down. And a horizontal tunnel cut into a cliff base becomes a natural drain. But the Roth was bone dry. The floor was compacted sand and rock chips, undisturbed except for a single set of boot prints leading in and not coming back out. Darren pointed his headlamp at them. Recent? I crouched down. The prints were well defined, with a clear tread pattern, some kind of hiking boot, maybe a size 10. The edges were sharp, not eroded by water or traffic. Months, maybe. One of Priya's hikers. Only going in, Darren said. They came out walking on their own prints, or they went deeper and the tracks just continue. He nodded. We went in. The adit ran straight for about 20 meters, following the bedding plane of the mossback sandstone. The walls showed tool marks, hand-drilled blast holes spaced at regular intervals, the characteristic signature of jackleg drilling. The ceiling was low enough that I had to duck in several places. Remnants of the ore-bearing bed were visible in the walls. Pale greenish-yellow carnotite staining in a band about 30 centimeters thick, striking roughly horizontal. The ludlum chirped steadily, the count rate climbing as we moved deeper. 200 counts per minute. 300. Nothing dangerous for a brief exposure, but enough to remind you that the rock itself was the hazard here. At approximately 30 meters, the adit widened into a small working chamber, what miners call a stope, though this one was barely larger than a bedroom. The ceiling rose to about 3 meters where the sandstone bed had been excavated upward. And in the center of the floor, exactly as the hiker had described, there was a hole. It was roughly circular, about 1.5 meters across, with irregular edges. Not drilled, not blasted. The rock around the rim was smooth in a way that suggested dissolution. Water working at the sandstone over a very long time, enlarging a natural joint or fracture into a vertical opening. A solution cavity. They're common enough in the Colorado Plateau geology. I'd documented similar features at limestone and sandstone sites before. But there were 2 things wrong with it. The first was the air. I felt it before I could explain it. A steady, cool updraft rising from the hole. Not a breeze. Not turbulence from the temperature differential between the surface and the underground. A sustained vertical flow of air moving upward through the opening with enough velocity to lift the hair on my forearms. I held my hand over the hole and felt it clearly, like standing over a floor vent in a heated building. I checked the MX4. Oxygen was 20.8%, slightly below surface normal, but well within safe limits. No hydrogen sulfide. No CO. The unit doesn't measure radon directly, but there was nothing in the gas profile to explain the updraft. Air moves through mines when there's a pressure differential, a second opening at a different elevation, or a connection to the surface through fractured rock. A single-level adit with one portal shouldn't produce this kind of airflow unless there's a significant void system below it, connected to the atmosphere somewhere else. The second thing was the sound. I don't mean a dramatic sound. I don't mean something that made us jump or reach for each other. I mean that when we stood at the edge of that hole and turned off our headlamps, which we did, because visual assessment of depth requires letting your eyes adjust and watching for any ambient light from below. When we stood in total darkness and listened, there was something coming up from the hole that wasn't quite silence. It was rhythmic, very slow, a cycle of maybe 8 to 10 seconds. A faint increase in the air pressure against my face, then a decrease, then an increase, like the hole was breathing. Darren turned his headlamp back on. I could see his eyes above the respirator, and they were the eyes of someone running calculations. Not afraid. Thinking. Barometric pumping, he said. Pressure differential between a large underground void and the surface. You get it in caves. At this frequency. If the void is big enough and the connection is narrow enough, sure. It's essentially a Helmholtz resonator. I knew what a Helmholtz resonator was. A bottle. You blow across the top of a bottle and it produces a tone because the air in the neck oscillates against the air volume inside. Darren was suggesting that the hole was the neck, and there was a chamber below it large enough to sustain a slow oscillation driven by atmospheric pressure changes. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also the first and last time either of us would successfully explain anything about the Roth lease. We dropped a rock. It fell for approximately 2 seconds before the sound cut off. Not the sharp crack of impact, but an abrupt cessation, as if the rock had passed through a boundary where sound no longer traveled upward. Darren and I looked at each other. We dropped a second rock, a larger one. Same result. A brief clatter against the walls of the shaft, growing fainter, then gone. No impact sound. 2 seconds of free fall in a vacuum is roughly 20 meters. In air, with the rock bouncing off the sides, maybe 15. That's a significant vertical extent for a feature that doesn't appear in any production record, geological survey, or claim documentation for this mine. We set up the continuous radon monitor at the rim of the hole, deployed 2 alpha track canisters at the portal and in the stope, and marked the shaft with flagging tape. Protocol was clear. We weren't equipped for vertical work, and descending an uncharacterized shaft in an abandoned uranium mine with no rescue support and no communication with the surface was exactly the kind of decision that gets people written up in accident reports. We packed out, drove back to Blanding, and I called Priya. "How deep?" she asked. "At least 15 meters. Could be more." The acoustics were strange. We couldn't hear the impact. Wind noise? No. There was an updraft, but it was steady. So the sound just stopped. She was quiet for a moment. "I'll request a LiDAR survey through the state. That'll take weeks, though. Can you get a camera down there?" "We have a GoPro and paracord. We could lower it." "Do that Monday. I want visual confirmation before I start writing requisitions." We spent the weekend in Blanding. Darren went for a run Saturday morning, came back, and pulled out his laptop. He'd been thinking about the airflow calculation. "I ran the numbers on the Helmholtz model," he said, sitting on the edge of his motel bed with the laptop balanced on his knees. "For the frequency we observed, call it 0.1 hertz, 1 cycle every 10 seconds. The volume of the resonating chamber would need to be enormous. I'm talking on the order of 50,000 cubic meters." I waited. Doing that's a space roughly 40 meters on a side and 30 meters tall, in sandstone that has no documented karst development, in a formation that doesn't produce caves. So the model doesn't work. The model works fine. The geology doesn't support it. There shouldn't be a void that size in the mossback member. There's no mechanism for it. Darren wasn't the kind of person who was comfortable with that conclusion. He spent the rest of the weekend reading papers on his phone about paleo-karst in the Chinle Formation, solution collapse features in the Paradox Basin, and evaporate dissolution in the underlying Hermosa group. He found a few references to breccia pipes, vertical collapse structures caused by the dissolution of deep salt or gypsum beds that could theoretically produce large voids. But breccia pipes are mapped features, and they show up in aerial photography as circular depressions. The Roth lease site showed nothing. Monday morning, we drove back. The weather had changed. A cold front had come through Saturday night, dropping the temperature into the low 30s and leaving a skim of frost on the shadowed ground. The sky was the kind of deep, empty blue that you only see in the desert west at altitude, and the red cliffs looked almost purple in the early light. We reached the portal at 9:15. Everything was as we'd left it. Flagging tape intact, boot prints undisturbed, alpha track canisters in position. We retrieved the continuous radon monitor first. Darren powered it up and pulled the data. Then he showed me the screen without saying anything. The monitor logs radon concentration in picocuries per liter every 15 minutes. Background radon outdoors in this part of Utah runs around 1 to 2 picocuries per liter. Inside a uranium mine adit, you'd expect elevated levels, maybe 20 to 50 picocuries per liter in a poorly ventilated space. The EPA action level for residential exposure is 4 picocuries per liter. OSHA's limit for occupational exposure corresponds to much higher concentrations, but with strict time limits. The Roth Lease monitor showed a baseline of about 30 picocuries per liter for the first 12 hours. Then, at 9:47 p.m. Friday, roughly 6 hours after we'd left, the reading dropped to 0.4 picocuries per liter, below outdoor background, and it stayed there. For the entire weekend, the radon concentration at the rim of a shaft inside a uranium mine registered lower than the ambient air outside. "Instrument malfunction?" I said. "It was calibrated 3 weeks ago, and it didn't flatline. Look." He scrolled through the data. The readings showed normal variation, small fluctuations of a few tenths of a picocurie around the 0.4 baseline. "It's reading accurately. There's just no radon. Something is pulling the radon down into the shaft. Or something is pushing clean air up." We rigged the GoPro. Darren had brought 100 meters of paracord, which was overkill for what we expected. But Darren always packed for the scenario beyond the one he'd planned for. We zip-tied the camera to a small LED floodlight, set it to record, and lowered it into the hole. The shaft was roughly cylindrical, narrowing slightly as it descended. The walls were smooth, not tooled, not blasted, but worn in a way that resembled water erosion in a pothole or canyon slot. The sandstone showed the same moss-back lithology for the first several meters, then transitioned into the darker red-brown of the underlying Chinle Formation. That transition was significant. It meant the shaft penetrated through the Chinle entirely and into older rock below, something that natural dissolution alone shouldn't produce in this geology without a soluble layer to dissolve. At 18 meters, the LED light began to behave strangely on the GoPro feed. Not flickering, the power supply was a fresh lithium battery pack, but the illumination seemed to be absorbed more rapidly by the surrounding rock. The circle of light on the walls contracted as if the air itself were becoming denser or darker. Darren and I watched the live feed on his phone, connected by a 10-meter cable to the camera. At 22 meters, the shaft widened abruptly. The walls fell away on all sides, and the camera hung in open space, the LED illuminating nothing but itself and the cord above it. "Stop," Darren said. I held the cord. The camera swung gently, rotating in the updraft. On the screen, the light swept across empty darkness in every direction. No walls, no floor visible, no ceiling. "How much cord is out?" I asked. Darren checked the marks he'd made. 22 meters. We lowered another 10 meters. Still nothing. The camera hung in a void, with no visible boundaries. The LED should have illuminated rock at a distance of at least 15 meters in clear air, but the feed showed only the cone of light fading into black, as if the space were filled with something that scattered the photons before they could reach a surface. At 35 meters, The live feed cut out. Not static, not interference. The screen on Darren's phone simply went to the no signal graphic. The cable was intact. The cord was intact. I pulled the camera up slowly, and the feed came back at about 30 meters. Below that, nothing. We retrieved the camera and played back the recorded footage. The file was intact up to the 35-meter mark. The last 3 seconds of usable video showed something that Darren and I watched 4 times in the cab of the truck before either of us said a word. The camera had been rotating slowly on the cord, and as it passed the 35-meter depth, the LED swept across something in the void. It was visible for less than 2 seconds. A surface, not rock, not water, not anything I can compare to a known material. It was dark, approximately vertical, and it had texture. The closest analogy I can offer is the bark of a very old tree, but scaled up enormously. Deep furrows running vertically, with a regularity that didn't look geological. The surface was maybe 4 meters from the camera when the light caught it, and in the last clear frame before the signal dropped, the furrows appeared to shift. Not uniformly, not like a shadow moving across a static surface. The surface itself rearranged. Darren played that last second at quarter speed on his laptop back at the motel. He isolated the frames. In frame 1, the furrows ran roughly parallel, spaced about 15 centimeters apart. In frame 2, 1/30th of a second later, the spacing had changed. Some furrows had merged, others had widened. The pattern was different but equally regular, as if the surface had reorganized itself between frames. "That's not possible in sandstone," I said. "That's not sandstone," Darren said. "That's not any rock." "Camera distortion, lens warp from the rotation?" He shook his head. "I can correct for rotational distortion. I already did. The surface changed." I didn't argue with him. I'd seen it too. I'd watched the same 2 frames and reached the same conclusion before I started reaching for alternatives. The surface 35 meters below a uranium mine in the Utah desert had moved while the camera was pointing at it. We called Priya Tuesday morning. I described the shaft dimensions, the void at the bottom, the anomalous radon readings. I did not mention the surface. I told myself this was because I wanted to analyze the footage more thoroughly before making a claim I couldn't support. That was partly true, but I also noticed that when I opened my mouth to describe what the camera had recorded, the words felt wrong. Not forbidden, not scary, just wrong. Like trying to describe a color to someone who hasn't seen it. The vocabulary I had was adequate for sandstone, for solution cavities, for every geological phenomenon I'd been trained to identify. It was not adequate for this. Darren noticed my omission. He didn't challenge it in front of Priya, but after the call he said, "You didn't tell her about the surface." "No." "Why?" "Because I don't know what it is. And I don't want to file a report that says, 'We saw something weird on camera,' to a federal agency that's paying us for a hazard assessment. It's a hazard. It's a video artifact until we prove otherwise." He looked at me for a long time. "Okay," he said. "Then let's prove otherwise." This was the decision point, and I want to be honest about how it felt. I was not drawn to the Roth lease. I did not feel a compulsion to return or a fascination that overrode my judgment. What I felt was professional discomfort, the specific nagging awareness that I had documented something I couldn't classify, and that leaving it unclassified in a report would be a failure of the work I was being paid to do. Darren felt the same thing, but calibrated differently. Where I wanted to rule out the anomaly, he wanted to characterize it, and the difference sounds subtle. It wasn't. We went back Wednesday with better equipment. Darren had driven to Moab on Tuesday afternoon and rented a higher-powered LED array, a construction-grade unit that threw 20,000 lumens, and a longer cable for the GoPro. We also brought the thermal imaging camera from our vehicle kit, a flare unit we normally used for detecting heat signatures around waste piles. The morning was colder, mid-20s, with ice in the shadows that wouldn't melt until noon. The desert smelled like sage and frozen dust. I remember that clearly because it was the last time the drive to the Roth lease felt routine. We reached the portal and immediately knew something was different. The boot prints we'd observed on our first visit, the single set going in, were gone. Not scuffed or obscured. Gone. The floor of the adit, which had been compacted sand and rock chips, was now smooth. Uniformly smooth, as if the surface had been graded or swept with a precision that no human hand could achieve. The sand was still there, but every grain was level. No footprints, no tool marks, no trace of our own boots from the previous visits, even though we'd been in and out of that tunnel 3 times. Darren crouched in the entrance and ran his palm across the floor. He picked up a handful of sand, let it sift through his fingers, and watched it fall. It settled into the same perfect level, each grain finding its place as if guided by something more organized than gravity. "Wind," I said. "We've had 2 days of weather. The wind doesn't blow inside an adit, and this isn't drift sand. This is the same material, mine spoil, rock chips. I compacted fines. It's been rearranged in place." He was right. The floor hadn't been covered by wind-blown sand from outside. The existing material had been reorganized, leveled, smoothed. Every step we took left clear prints in the surface, and I found myself walking carefully, the way you walk across a fresh concrete pour. Not because I was afraid of disturbing something, but because the surface so clearly communicated that it was not supposed to be disturbed. We reached the stope. The shaft was unchanged. The updraft was still there. But the radon monitor we'd left at the rim was gone. Not displaced, not fallen into the shaft. The instrument had been sitting on a flat section of rock at the edge of the hole, secured with a bungee cord around a drill steel stub protruding from the wall. The bungee cord was still there. He looped around the stub, both clips fastened to each other as if the monitor had been carefully removed and the cord resecured. The alpha track canisters we'd placed at the portal and in the stope were also missing, with the same careful absence. Mounting brackets still in place, no sign of forced removal. "Someone's been in here," Darren said. The floor was clean, no prints. "Then someone's been in here and smoothed the floor afterward." We stood with that for a moment. The silence underground was different from the silence outside. Outside, there's wind and distant ravens and the tick of cooling rock. Inside the adit, the only sound was the slow respiration of the shaft. That 10-second cycle of pressure, increase and decrease. It was louder than it had been Friday. Or maybe I was listening harder. Darren lowered the new camera rig. The 20,000 lumen LED was transformative. The shaft walls lit up like an operating theater. And for the first 20 meters, the video feed showed the same smooth, water-worn sandstone transitioning into Moenkopi red-brown. At 22 meters, the void opened up again. This time, with the stronger light, we could see further. The void was not a sphere or a dome or any shape that karst processes typically produce. It was elongated vertically. The camera showed walls receding in every horizontal direction beyond the reach of the light. But the vertical dimension was visible because the light caught the far wall at an angle. The ceiling of the void, if it was a ceiling, was at least 40 meters above the point where the shaft entered it. The shaft didn't open from the top of the chamber. It opened from somewhere in the middle. The void extended upward as well as downward. I felt Darren process this at the same time I did. The shaft went down 22 meters from the mine floor. The chamber extended upward another 40 meters above the entry point. That put the top of the void roughly 18 meters above the surface of the desert. That was impossible. There was no surface expression, no sinkhole, no collapse, no depression in the terrain above the mine. We'd walked that ground. It was solid sandstone. "The light is doing something wrong," Darren said. "The angles don't make sense. Can you hold the cord steady?" I braced it against the rim. The camera stabilized, pointing straight down. The LED illuminated the space below. And for the first time, we could see the floor of the void, and it was 50 meters below the entry point. The camera showed it clearly, a flat surface, lighter in color than the walls, with a texture that the resolution couldn't quite resolve. And the surface was marked. Not randomly, not with geological patterns. The floor of the void bore a series of parallel lines, evenly spaced, running from one edge of the visible area to the other. They were straight. They were regular. And at the intersection points, where lines crossed, there were small raised features that might have been nodules or protrusions. Darren zoomed the camera. The raised features were uniform, rounded on top, spaced at intervals that repeated with mathematical precision. "Those are made," Darren said. His voice was flat. He wasn't frightened. He was recalibrating. "They could be mineral concretions. Moki marbles form in Navajo sandstone in regular patterns. Self-organizing geological processes can produce at 50 meters below surface in the Moen-Kopi Formation, which doesn't produce concretions, in a void that shouldn't exist, arranged in a grid." I stopped talking. He was right, and I knew he was right. And the part of me that was constructing alternative explanations knew it too. But that part was still working, still generating hypotheses, because that's what it does. That's what 11 years of site assessments had trained it to do. Find the boring explanation, document it, move on. The camera was still recording. Darren let it hang, rotating slowly at 50 meters. The LED swept across the floor of the void in a wide arc. And as it did, the grid pattern remained consistent. Lines and nodes extending as far as the light reached. It wasn't a small feature. It covered the entire visible floor area, which at that distance and light level was at least 30 meters in diameter. Then the camera caught the wall, the same surface we'd seen Friday. The dark, furrowed, vertical plane at the edge of the void. But this time, with the 20,000 lumen array, we could see it properly. It wasn't a rock face. It wasn't sediment. The furrows were deep, 20, 30 centimeters, and they moved while the light was on them. Not quickly, not dramatically, but continuously, the way bark on a tree doesn't move, except this did. The furrows shifted laterally, contracting and dilating in a slow rhythm that did not match the respiratory cycle of the shaft. It was a different frequency, a faster, maybe one cycle every 3 or 4 seconds. The surface was alive with this motion, and the motion was silent, and the light falling on it didn't seem to reflect so much as sink in it slightly before returning, as if the material had a refractive quality that wasn't quite opaque and wasn't quite transparent. I pulled the camera up. Darren didn't protest. We packed the equipment and walked out of the adit in silence, and we drove 40 minutes back to Blanding without speaking. And when we got to the motel, I sat on the edge of the bed and realized my hands were shaking. It wasn't fear. I want to be precise about that. It was the physiological response to having seen something that I could not reconcile with anything I knew, and not being able to tell whether the failure was in my perception, my knowledge, or in the thing itself. The trembling was my body catching up to an assessment my conscious mind hadn't finished making. Darren made coffee with the in-room drip machine. He set a cup on the nightstand beside me and sat in the desk chair and said, "We need to tell Priya." Tell her what? That there's a significant subsurface void with anomalous characteristics. That the physical hazard assessment is incomplete without vertical exploration. That the site warrants a more detailed investigation by a team with confined space rescue capability. That's not what you want to tell her. No, but it's what will get people out here who can go down that shaft and see what we're seeing. And what are we seeing, Darren? He looked at me steadily. I don't know. That's the point. I called Priya the next morning and reported the void. I described its dimensions as best I could estimate them. I mentioned the grid pattern on the floor. I did not describe the wall surface. The omission was deliberate this time, and I knew it was deliberate. And I told myself it was because a verbal description of a moving rock surface would make me sound unreliable. That was true. But it was also true that I didn't want anyone else to go down that shaft. I recognized this impulse as irrational. I noted it, the way you note the onset of a headache, a development to be monitored, not a crisis. Darren had shown me the footage again that morning, frame by frame, and we'd both watched the wall in motion, and I'd felt something I can only describe as a reluctance to share. Not because the information was mine, but because the thing itself felt, I'm going to use this word carefully, private, and as though we'd been shown something that was not intended for wide distribution. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded then. I overrode it and made the call to Priya and gave her a factual report, minus the wall. She said she'd contact the State Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining about a follow-up team. She said it might take 2 to 3 weeks. She asked if we could continue with the remaining sites in the meantime. We could. We did. Sites 8 through 11 were unremarkable. Small prospect workings, standard hazards, readings within expected ranges. We documented them in 2 days. On Saturday morning, with the fieldwork nominally complete except for the Roth follow-up, we should have driven back to Boise. The contract scope was satisfied for 10 of 11 sites. The Roth assessment was flagged as incomplete pending further investigation. Our professional obligation was fulfilled. We didn't leave. I called my wife Megan that evening and told her we'd extended for a few days to finish documentation. She asked if everything was fine. I said yes. It was not a lie in any measurable sense. Everything was fine in the way that a locked door is fine as long as you don't try to open it. The situation was contained. The anomaly was reported. The proper authorities were engaged. There was no reason for us to return to the Roth lease. Darren and I went back Sunday. We didn't discuss it as a decision. We ate breakfast at the diner on Main Street, and when we got in the truck, Darren turned south toward 95 instead of north toward I-70. And I didn't say anything, and neither did he. And then we drove the 14 miles and then the 3 miles and parked at the waste rock pile and put on our respirators and went inside. The floor of the adit was smooth again. Our footprints from Wednesday, which should have persisted in the sheltered interior, were gone. The surface was level. Perfect. The same uncanny precision, every grain in its designated place. Walking across it felt transgressive in a way I couldn't justify. The shaft was the same. The updraft was the same. The breathing rhythm was the same. 10 seconds, maybe 11. We lowered the camera, At 35 meters, where we'd lost signal on Friday, the feed held. The new cable was better shielded, and the signal was strong. The camera descended into the void, and the LED lit up the floor, and the grid was there, unchanged. But there was something else. On the floor of the void, near the center of the visible grid, there was a cluster of objects that had not been there Wednesday. They were small. The camera resolution and the distance made precise identification impossible. But they appeared to be roughly cylindrical, arranged in a tight group. There were 7 of them. "What is that?" Darren said. I lowered the camera further. At 45 meters, the objects came into better focus. They were approximately the size and shape of the Alpha Track canisters we deployed in the adit. The same white plastic housing, the same cylindrical profile. "Those are our canisters," I said. "We deployed 2. There are 7. I counted again. 7 white cylinders, arranged in a circle on the grid-marked floor 50 meters below the mine. 2 of them were ours. The other 5 were identical. And the radon monitor, the Ludlum continuous monitor that had vanished from the rim of the shaft, was there too. It sat at the center of the 7 canisters, upright, its LED display facing the camera. At this distance, the screen was too small to read, but it was lit. The instrument was running. Darren was breathing hard through his respirator. I could hear the intake valve clicking. Someone put our equipment down there. Someone put our equipment down there and added 5 more canisters that we didn't bring. Where did the extra canisters come from? I didn't have an answer. The Alpha Track canisters we used were a common type, available from any radiation safety supplier. But we were the only survey team assigned to this site, and there was no indication that anyone else had been in the mine. "Let's pull the camera up," Darren said suddenly. "I want to look at the wall again." I adjusted the cord, swinging the camera toward the furrowed surface we'd observed on Wednesday. The LED caught it. The furrows were wider. The rhythm of their contraction was faster, 2 seconds per cycle, maybe less. And the surface had extended. On Wednesday, it had occupied 1 segment of the void wall, maybe 10 meters across. Now it covered the entire visible circumference. Every wall of the void, as far as the light could reach, displayed the same moving, furrowed texture. It was growing. We pulled the camera up and walked out and sat in the truck, and Darren said, "I'm going to go down there." "No. We need samples. We need close-range photography. We need to retrieve our instruments and figure out where the extra canisters came from. No one from the state is going to come out here for 3 weeks. And by then what?" He paused. "I don't know. It's changing. It's different every time we go in. If we wait 3 weeks, we might not be looking at the same thing. That's an argument for waiting, not for going down. It's an argument for documenting it now, while we can." We argued about this for an hour, sitting in the truck with the engine off, the desert cooling around us as the sun dropped toward the western cliffs. I was against it. Darren was for it. My objections were procedural. No rescue team, no communication with the surface, no confined space entry permit. His responses were practical. The shaft was wide enough for a person. We had rope and harnesses, and the worst physical hazard was the depth of the drop, which was manageable with the equipment we had. He won. Not because his arguments were better, but because I realized that my resistance wasn't coming from professional caution. It was coming from the same place as my reluctance to describe the wall surface to Priya. A possessiveness that had no rational basis. A feeling that sending someone down that shaft was wrong. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was an intrusion. That feeling was the thing I should have listened to. Not because it was right. It was bizarre and unfounded and completely unlike my normal decision-making process. But because it was new. It was a response I'd never had to a site before. And new responses to familiar situations are data points. I should have treated it as evidence that something about the Roth lease was affecting my judgment. Instead, I overrode it and helped Darren rig the rope. We went back Monday morning with a plan. Darren would descend on a single rope technique setup, a 60-meter static line anchored to a drill steel cluster in the stope ceiling, with a rack descender and a Prusik backup. I would manage the rope from the rim. He'd carry the thermal camera, a sample kit, and a handheld radio, though we both knew the radio would be useless if the signal cut out the way the camera feed had. The morning was clear and cold. The drive felt different this time, not routine, not tense, but attended. I don't know how else to describe it. The landscape seemed to be paying attention. The juniper trees on the approach road stood very still, though there was wind at our elevation. The waste rock pile at the portal was unchanged. The portal was open. Inside, the floor was smooth. Darren clipped into the rope and sat on the rim of the shaft. The updraft pushed his pant legs against his shins. The breathing cycle was still there. 10 seconds, maybe 12. He looked up at me. If the radio cuts out, I'll tug the rope. 2 tugs means I'm okay. 3 means pull me up. Continuous tugging means pull me up fast. Okay. If I stop communicating entirely, wait 10 minutes, then pull me up regardless. Okay. He went over the edge. I paid out the rope and watched his headlamp shrink. The radio worked for the first 20 meters. His voice was calm, narrating what he saw. Smooth walls, color transition at the Moenkopi contact, the shaft widening. At 22 meters, the void. I'm in the chamber, he said. The walls are, Jesus, they're everywhere. The whole space is lined with it. The surface, I mean. The moving surface. It's covering everything. How far can you see? The headlamp reaches maybe 15 meters. The surface goes beyond that in every direction. There's a pattern to the movement. The furrows aren't random. They're propagating in waves. Like, you know when wind moves across a field of grain? Like that, but vertical. Take samples. I'm going to try. Descending further. At 35 meters, the radio failed. Not static, silence. The rope continued to pay out smoothly. I counted 1 minute, 2. The rope jerked, 2 tugs. He was okay. 3 minutes, 4. The rope paid out, then stopped. He'd reached the bottom, or he'd stopped descending. I waited. The breathing cycle in the shaft seemed louder now, and faster. 7 seconds between cycles instead of 10. The rope jerked twice, and then nothing. 5 minutes. I gripped the rope and prepared to pull. And then the rope went slack, not gradually, not like he was ascending. All at once, 60 meters of tension simply vanished. The rope fell limp in my hands. I hauled it up, arm over arm, my chest tight, the sweat under my respirator suddenly cold. The rope came up clean, all 60 meters. The end that Darren had been clipped to, was intact. The carabiner was still closed. The harness webbing was still threaded through the descender. But the harness was empty. The leg loops were buckled. The waist belt was buckled. Every strap was secured exactly as it would be if the harness were being worn by a human body. But there was no body in it. I pulled the whole assembly out of the shaft and spread it on the stope floor and stared at it. The harness was warm. Not body warm. A different warm, like a surface that has been in the sun, though it had been 50 meters underground in total darkness. I screamed Darren's name into the shaft. The sound went down and didn't come back. Not even an echo. The breathing continued. 7 seconds, steady, indifferent. The next 40 minutes are the worst of my life. I'll describe them as briefly as I can. I ran to the truck. There was no cell service. I drove 9 miles to the junction with 95, where I sometimes got 1 bar and called 911. I gave the dispatcher the GPS coordinates and described the situation. A man had fallen in an abandoned mine shaft. I couldn't reach him. I needed a rescue team. She transferred me to San Juan County Search and Rescue. I repeated everything. They said a team would mobilize from Monticello, ETA 2 hours minimum, and I drove back to the mine. I went into the adit. The floor was smooth. My footprints from 20 minutes earlier were gone. I reached the stope. The rope and harness were where I'd left them. The shaft was open. The breathing continued, and Darren's voice came up from the hole. Not shouting, not distressed, conversational, clear, as if he were standing next to me instead of 50 meters down in a void that had swallowed him. "Hey," he said, "can you lower the rope back down?" "Darren." "I'm fine. I'm on the floor of the chamber. The harness slipped. I think the waist buckle failed. I landed on something soft. I'm not injured." "Your harness is up here. It's buckled. Every strap is—" "I know, it's weird. I can't explain it either. But I'm fine, and I need the rope to get back up. Can you lower it?" His voice was perfect. The tone, the cadence, the slight nasality he got when he'd been breathing through a respirator. It was Darren. I would have testified to that in any setting. But I didn't lower the rope. I stood at the rim, and I held the rope, and I listened to his voice. And something in me, not in my training, not in my professional judgment, but in the animal architecture of my nervous system, the part that knows when it's being hunted before the conscious mind has identified the predator. Something in me said no. "Darren, the rescue team is coming. Stay where you are." "I don't need a rescue team. I just need the rope. I can prusik up." "Stay where you are." A pause. 3 breathing cycles of the shaft. Then, "Okay, hey, you should see this down here, though. The grid on the floor, the raised features, they're not mineral concretions. I think they're biological. They look like they're growing." "Stay where you are, Darren. I'm not going anywhere. But listen, the surface on the walls, I touched it. It's warm." And it responded to contact. It shifted under my hand, not pulling away, not pushing, more like adjusting, like it was making room. "Stop touching it." I already stopped, but it's still moving. The whole chamber is... I think it knows we've been coming back. I think the floor of the adit is part of it. The smoothing. It's been preparing? Is that the right word? "Darren, stop talking and wait for the rescue team." "Sure. Hey, one more thing. The extra canisters, the ones that weren't ours. I opened one. There's nothing inside. No filter, no detector. Just the housing. They're not instruments. They're copies." The radio silence that followed was not the silence of a broken connection. It was the silence of someone who has stopped choosing to speak. It lasted until the rescue team arrived. San Juan County Search and Rescue came with 6 people, a litter, and a vertical extraction kit. I met them at the portal and briefed the team lead, a paramedic named Torres, on the shaft dimensions and the last communication. I did not describe the moving surface. I described a geological void with an injured climber at the bottom. Torres and 2 team members went in. I followed to the stope. They assessed the shaft, rigged their own line, and Torres descended. He was down for 12 minutes. His radio worked intermittently. I heard fragments. "Can see the floor," and "nobody here," and "What the hell is this?" He came up pale and breathing hard and said there was no one in the void. The chamber was empty. No person, no equipment, no grid pattern on the floor. Just a large, roughly spherical natural cavity in the rock, with smooth walls and a slightly damp floor. No grid, no canisters, no radon monitor, no Darren, no moving surface. "It's just a cave," Torres said. "A big one, but just a cave." "Are you sure your partner went down?" I showed him the harness. He looked at it for a long time. He radioed for the county sheriff. The next 3 days were an investigation. The sheriff's department treated it as a missing person case. They brought a second team in with better rope access and a cave-rated drone, and the drone surveyed the void from multiple angles. Every image showed the same thing: a natural dissolution cavity, unremarkable except for its size, with no features, no artifacts, no grid, no biological surface. They never found Darren. His truck was at the motel. His field notes were on the desk. His laptop was open to the spectral analysis of the wall footage. When the detective assigned to the case reviewed the laptop, the video files from the GoPro were there. They played. They showed the interior of a mine shaft and a large underground cavity with smooth walls and a damp floor. The moving surface, the grid, the canisters, none of it was in the footage. The files had the same timestamps, the same durations, the same metadata. But the content was different. The footage showed exactly what Torres had described. A cave. Just a cave. I watched it sitting in the sheriff's office in Monticello, and I felt the ground shift under me in a way that had nothing to do with geology. Either the footage had changed, or I had never seen what I thought I had seen. Or Darren and I had shared a delusion so specific and detailed that we discussed it, analyzed it, argued about it over the course of a week without ever noticing it wasn't real. None of those options left me anywhere I could stand. I called Megan. I told her what had happened, the real version, all of it, including the surface and the grid and the voice from the shaft. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Come home." Not as a comfort, as a directive. She understood before I did that the issue was not what I'd seen, but what I was doing. Staying in Blanding, returning to the motel room where Darren's things were still spread across the desk, circling the absence of an explanation the way a dog circles a spot where food used to be. I drove home to Boise. The investigation continued without me. Over the following weeks, I learned that the BLM had closed the Roth lease site, that the portal had been sealed with a concrete plug, and that Darren's disappearance remained classified as a missing persons case with no leads. His family contacted me twice. I told them everything I could, which was the sanitized version, a fall in an abandoned mine, a void that the rescue team found empty, no explanation. His mother asked if he could have wandered out through a second exit. I said it was possible. It wasn't. Priya called me once, about a month later. She said the state geologist had reviewed the GoPro footage and confirmed the void as a natural karst feature, unusual for the formation, but not unprecedented. She said the radon data from the continuous monitor, the data showing the anomalous drop to 0.4 picocuries per liter, was no longer in the instrument's memory. The monitor had been found in the sealed portal area after the concrete plug was poured, retrieved by the remediation crew. Its data log showed normal readings, elevated but unremarkable, consistent with a uranium mine adit. No anomalous drop, no 60 hours of near-zero radon. "The data's different," I told her. "The data's what the instrument recorded," she said. "I know this is hard." I didn't push it. What would I push against? The instrument said one thing, my memory said another. Darren's notes, which I had, because the sheriff returned his field notebook to the firm as part of the personal effects. Said another still. His handwritten entries, numbered and cross-referenced and immaculate, described exactly what I remembered. Radon at 0.4 picocuries per liter. The void dimensions, the grid pattern, the surface movement. But Darren's notebook is paper. It's not an instrument. It's not a recording. It's the account of a man who disappeared under unexplained circumstances, written in his own hand, and it agrees with the account of the last person to see him alive. In any investigation, that's not corroboration. That's a single narrative from a single source. I stopped working for Bridger Environmental 3 months after the Utah contract. The firm was understanding. They knew about Darren. They gave me leave. They recommended a counselor who specialized in occupational trauma. I saw the counselor. She was competent and kind. She helped me develop frameworks for managing intrusive thoughts and hypervigilance. She did not, and could not, help me with the central problem, which was not psychological but epistemological. I had either seen something real that all evidence now denied, or I had experienced a detailed, shared hallucination that left physical traces. The missing equipment, the empty harness, which were themselves explicable by more mundane hypotheses. The harness. I need to talk about the harness. Darren's climbing harness, the one I'd pulled from the shaft with every buckle secured and no body inside it, was logged by the sheriff's department as evidence. I saw the evidence photo. It was Darren's harness. Black diamond momentum. His size, his name written on the gear loop in silver Sharpie. But in the evidence photo, the waist belt buckle was open. The leg loops were unbuckled. The harness was laid out flat, unthreaded from the descender. I had pulled that harness from the shaft, fully buckled. I had spread it on the stope floor and stared at it. I had pointed it out to Torres. Torres's incident report states that the harness was found unbuckled and separated from the rope system, consistent with the user having removed it prior to an unroped descent. Torres saw an unbuckled harness. I saw a buckled one. We were standing in the same room. This is the part I can't get past. Not the void, not the surface, not the grid or the voice or the erased data. Those could all be filed under unexplained, a category I've made peace with, or at least detente. What I cannot reconcile is the harness. Because either my perception was wrong in real time, while I was holding the object in my hands and examining it with full attention and clear cognition, or Torres's perception was wrong in real time under the same conditions. And in either case, one of us was seeing a physical object in a state it was not in, and neither of us had any reason to hallucinate. Megan and I have talked about this more than we've talked about anything else in our marriage. She has a theory, though she wouldn't call it that. She'd call it a direction. She thinks that whatever is in that void doesn't just exist in space. It exists in the record. It can be in the footage, and then not be in the footage. It can be in the data, and then not be in the data. It can be in the state of a buckle, and then not be in the state of a buckle. The thing that Darren and I found isn't just physically anomalous. It is anomalous to observation. It sits in the gap between what is perceived and what is recorded, and it edits. She thinks Darren is still in the void, not dead, not alive in the way we'd recognize. Present, the way the grid was present when we looked, and absent when Torres looked. She thinks the voice I heard was really his, and that his request for the rope was genuine, and that my refusal, that animal no that came from somewhere deeper than my training, saved me not from a trap, but from joining him in a state that is real but unverifiable. I don't know if she's right. I don't know if the word right applies. What I know is this. 8 months after I came home, and I was cleaning out the garage on a Saturday morning, and I found a white plastic cylinder on the workbench. It was an Alpha Track radon canister, the kind I use. The kind Darren and I deployed at the Roth Lease. But I hadn't brought any home. My field kit was clean. I'd inventoried it. I opened the canister. Inside, where the detector should be, there was nothing. Just the housing. Empty. A copy. I put it in a plastic bag and put the bag in a shoebox, and put the shoebox on the top shelf of the hall closet. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't call Priya. I didn't call Darren's family. 3 weeks later, there were 2 canisters on the workbench. Last month, there were 4. I haven't opened the new ones. Megan has seen them. She doesn't ask me to explain them. She watches me the way I imagine I watch the floor of the adit, noting the change, cataloging the progression, waiting to see what the next count will be. We're not leaving this house. That's not defiance, and it's not paralysis. It's a practical assessment. If the canisters are appearing here, then here is where the phenomenon is. Moving won't change that. You don't outrun something that edits evidence. You don't flee from something that was in the footage and then wasn't. Wherever I go, the gap between what I perceive and what the record shows will go with me. Because the gap isn't in the geography. It's in the relationship between seeing and having seen. Darren understood this. I think that's why he wanted to go down. Not because he was drawn, not because the void was seductive, but because he recognized that the thing we'd found existed in a category that could only be investigated from inside. You can't study it with instruments, because instruments record what can be agreed upon. And this thing disagrees. You can't study it remotely, because the distance between observer and subject is exactly the space it occupies. It lives in the margin between what happened and what the evidence says happened. And the only way to close that margin is to enter it. I chose not to enter it. I pulled the rope up and called for help and drove home, and held my wife and returned to a life where objects are what they are, and records match reality. And the count of white canisters on the workbench stays the same from week to week. Except it doesn't. And I don't know whether the next time I count, the number will be higher. I don't know whether one morning I'll walk into the garage and find 7. The original number we saw on the floor of the void, arranged in their circle, waiting. I don't know whether the floor of my garage will be smooth one day when I open the door. Every grain of concrete dust leveled, every footprint erased, as if something has been preparing the surface for a purpose I was never meant to understand. I don't know what Darren found at the bottom, but I think, eventually, I'm going to.